What happens when a neighbor breaks onto private land to throw a dream wedding? She had no idea that innocent sheep could turn her celebration into a real nightmare. What happened next left the entire neighborhood in complete shock. You ever try to do the right thing just to get kicked straight in the dignity for it? That's how this whole mess started. I wasn't bothering nobody. I wasn't loud. I wasn't flashy. I was just feeding my sheep and minding my business on my own land. But apparently minding your business is a threat now. It was a Saturday morning, crisp and bright. The kind of morning that makes you pause at the door just to breathe it in. My boots crunched over gravel as I headed to the barn with a couple buckets of feed. My sheep, sweet little knuckleheads, all 27 of them, were huddled near the gate, bleating like I was late for church. I stopped to scratch behind Buster's ears, the oldest ram in the flock, and refilled the water trough with a hose I'd patched up just last week. Nothing fancy, just a quiet, peaceful life I'd built with my hands. That's when I heard it, a ding, then another. My phone started going off like fireworks. A few texts from folks in town saying, "Did you rent your yard for a wedding? And nice tents, bro." At first, I thought they had the wrong person. But something felt off. Real off. I walked around the barn and right then, my stomach dropped. There were white tents everywhere. Not one. Not two. I'm talking 6, maybe 7 big ones, all lined up like some backyard circus. Floral garlands were draped across my fence. My trees had white ribbons tied around them. There was a DJ setting up speakers right next to my chicken coop, acting like he owned the place. People were unloading folding chairs, boxes of champagne, and a 3-tier cake. And standing smack in the middle of it all, like the queen of chaos herself, was Karen. Now let me explain something. Karen Tuckwell moved in next door about 9 months ago. She showed up in a white Range Rover wearing heels on gravel with a dog named Muffin that barked like it paid rent. Day 1, she complained about the livestock scent and asked if I could relocate the animals farther from the property line. Mind you, her property line was 30 feet from my barn. I told her, as politely as I could muster, "This ain't the suburbs, ma'am." She's the kind of woman who talks like everything she says is law. Real estate developer. Wears expensive sunglasses indoors. Hosts HOA meetings like she's running for office. And most importantly, she doesn't take no for an answer. I approached her slowly, boots crunching over grass that she'd covered in rose petals. "Karen," I said, calm but already boiling inside, "what is going on here?" She gave me the smile, not warm, not friendly, just smug. "Oh, Logan, you're back early. Isn't it gorgeous?" she chirped, twirling like she was auditioning for a bridal magazine. "My niece is getting married today. I figured your pasture would be perfect for the ceremony." My jaw tensed. "You figured my pasture? You didn't ask. You didn't even tell me." "Oh, don't be so territorial," she laughed, waving her hand like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "It's just grass. You weren't using it today, right?" I blinked at her, stunned. "Karen, this is private property. You can't just walk in and throw a wedding." "Oh, I cleared it with the HOA," she said, tilting her sunglasses down to meet my eyes. "Technically, they approved a temporary neighborhood celebration event." "Karen, I'm not part of the HOA." She shrugged. "Well, maybe you should be. It's how things get done around here." That's when I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a hostile takeover with canapes. I tried to keep my cool. I really did. I stepped back and looked around. My sheep had been pushed into the back corner of the lot, crammed against the fence like they were an eyesore. My garden gate was wide open. My hose, the one I just fixed, had been rerouted to fill buckets for flower arrangements. Some dude in a tuxedo shirt had the nerve to ask me to move the hay bales because they're in the shot. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You're in the shot of my patience." He blinked. I blinked. He walked away. Karen strutted off without another word, busy directing the flower girls or adjusting table linens or whatever else people do when they've hijacked someone's life for Instagram likes. Guests started arriving by the dozen. Cars parked halfway into my driveway. Some lady asked if I had any oat milk for her coffee. Oat milk? On a ranch? With sheep? I walked back to the barn, heart thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't angry just because they were rude. I was angry because this was my land. My parents worked the soil with their bare hands. I spent years rebuilding it after storms, after taxes, after loneliness. This place wasn't just home. It was earned. And she turned it into a photo booth. By noon, the DJ was pumping music loud enough to shake my window panes. My sheep were agitated. The chickens refused to leave their coop. And me? I sat on the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching strangers toast with champagne like they were in some rom-com montage, while I was the angry background farmer. I'll tell you what stung the most. Not one person. Not one. Looked around and asked, "Hey, who owns this place?" It was like I didn't exist. Like the land didn't belong to anybody but whoever looked good in heels. At one point, I caught a groomsman relieving himself behind my shed. I didn't even yell. I just stared at him until he turned around, zipped up, and shuffled off like a schoolboy caught cheating. Around 3 p.m., someone knocked on my door. It was a guy in a fancy vest and earpiece. "Sir," he said, all polite and corporate. "Ms. Tuckwell asked if you could stay inside during the ceremony. Just to keep the photos consistent." I laughed, loudly. Then I shut the door in his face. What happened next changed everything. You don't want to miss how this spun completely out of control. You ever sit in your own house and feel like a guest? I did. That afternoon, I sat by my window and watched an army of strangers sip drinks and pose for photos under the oak tree my daddy planted when I was a boy. I watched people use my barn wall as a backdrop like it was some fancy prop. Like it had no history, no weight, no soul. Just another Instagram-worthy background. And me? I was the background. The invisible man in his own yard. By 3:30, the ceremony was in full swing. Rows of guests sat neatly in white folding chairs, right where my sheep usually grazed. A string quartet played a sappy tune. Karen stood at the front with a clipboard, barking silent instructions like a stage director on Broadway. Her niece, the bride, was dabbing her eyes, and I'll admit she looked lovely. But let's not kid ourselves. That dress was floating on my lawn. Now, let me tell you what really hit a nerve. Some guy, I think he was the officiant or maybe just somebody who likes to hear himself talk, took the mic and said, "What a perfect, peaceful place for a union. You can just feel the serenity in the air." I nearly choked on my coffee. Serenity? That was rich. I peeked out the back window and saw 3 of my sheep huddled in the far corner of the fence, their heads poking through the gaps like prisoners looking for parole. My dog Duke sat by the barn door, ears pinned back from all the racket. Even my rooster, a loudmouth by nature, had given up trying to compete with the DJ and slumped in his coop like he'd lost custody of the morning. But it wasn't just the noise. It was the disrespect. A group of teenagers kicked around one of my old buckets like it was a soccer ball. Someone's aunt spilled red wine on the stone steps I laid by hand last spring. A little kid pulled my scarecrow out of the garden and started hitting another child with it like a sword. Nobody said a thing. Not one parent. Not one apology. And then came the moment that nearly sent me to the moon. I walked outside to check on the sheep. Quietly. No fuss. Just a quick look to make sure none of them had squeezed through the far fence. As I stepped past the barn, a woman in a bright yellow dress stopped mid-laugh, looked me up and down, and said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Oh, I thought the farmhands were off today." You know that feeling? That quiet burn in your chest? That mix of shock and disbelief? I turned and stared at her, straight in the eyes. I didn't say a word. I just looked, long enough for her smile to falter and her eyes to drop. Karen came stomping over, of course. "Logan," she hissed through gritted teeth. "We're about to start photos. I need you to stay out of the frame." I stood tall. "You need me to disappear on my own land?" She blinked, clearly surprised I had the nerve to respond. "This isn't the time, Logan. Don't make a scene." "Oh, I'm not making a scene," I said. "You made one the moment you rolled in here like you bought the deed." She scoffed. "You're being dramatic. It's just one afternoon." "No, ma'am. It was every afternoon. Every sideways look. Every complaint about my animals, my tools, the sound of my tractor. Every condescending suggestion about what I should do with my land. This was just the cherry on top. A full-blown hijack dressed up as elegance." The photos started. Flashbulbs went off. Karen waved a napkin in my direction like I was a stray dog to be shooed. I backed off. Not because I was scared, but because I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That's when things took a turn. "See, remember my sheep? Yeah, the ones crammed into the back of the lot like they were unwanted guests at their own home? Well, sheep don't like loud music. They don't like crowds. And they really don't like being trapped. So when two teenage boys decided it'd be funny to mess with the gate, not out of malice, just plain teenage stupidity, it popped open like a soda can on a hot day. 27 sheep. Freed. And guess what was happening at that exact moment? The first dance. The music started. The bride and groom stepped into the spotlight. The crowd stood, cameras raised. Karen clutched her phone with both hands like she was about to livestream royalty. And then hooves. Dozens of them. Buster, my oldest, led the charge. He came out trotting like a sheriff on patrol, followed by a storm of wool and confusion. Right into the wedding aisle. One of them headbutted the cake table. Another jumped straight over a flower arrangement. Guests screamed. Wine spilled. Someone fell into the punch bowl. I didn't move. I didn't laugh. I didn't cheer. But I didn't stop it either. Karen came storming toward me, mascara running, shoes in her hands. This is your fault, she shrieked. My fault. I asked calmly. Did I invite 100 people to trespass on my land and stress out my animals? She looked around like she'd just realized her kingdom was on fire. You could have done something. I did, I said. I tried to tell you this wasn't right. You didn't listen. By now someone had called security, I don't even know whose. The DJ had cut the music. Guests were scattering like pigeons. The bride was sobbing. A groomsman tried to herd the sheep and got chased by two of them in a slow-motion sprint that I will replay in my mind every time I need a laugh for the rest of my life. One of my neighbors, Miss Georgia from 2 houses down, came over. She handed me a cold soda and whispered, I saw everything. You handled it better than I would have. I nodded, still watching the chaos unfold. And for the first time that day, I smiled. Not because I wanted any of this, but because I hadn't lifted a finger and the truth stomped through their party in the form of muddy hooves and unapologetic justice. This is the climax. Everything you've been waiting for right here. Stick around to see how I finally put everyone in their place. You ever stand in the middle of your own land and feel like the dust is finally settled? Not from defeat, but from truth finally walking through the front door like it owned the place? That was me. Standing barefoot on damp grass, watching the last of the white folding chairs get packed up and loaded into a van that looked just as tired as Karen's makeup. The wedding was over. Correction, the invasion was over. And what they left behind? Muddy trails, broken wine glasses, scraps of ribbon, and a story this town's going to be telling for years. But let me tell you how it really ended. The sheep situation? Oh, that was just the spark. The real fire came afterward. See, Karen tried to do what Karen always does, shift blame, play the victim, and throw titles around like confetti. The very next morning, I got a knock on my door from a man in a gray suit holding a clipboard. Said he was conducting a property incident review on behalf of the HOA. I nearly laughed in his face. Son, I said, you're standing on private land that ain't under your association's jurisdiction. Unless the paper in your hand is an apology wrapped around a check, you're wasting daylight. He blinked like I spoke in Morse code, then mumbled something about clarifying boundaries and backed off. I wasn't playing anymore. I'd spent months swallowing my words, trying to be the neighbor who lets things slide. But watching my barn turned into a buffet line, watching my animals get corralled like they were props for a Pinterest board, that woke something up. I pulled out every record I had, property deeds, zoning maps, court papers from the last time HOA tried to overreach. I marched down to city records and requested copies of everything tied to my land. I highlighted, printed, even laminated some pages like a man preparing for battle. And then, I sent Karen a certified letter. No fluff, just facts. A full invoice for unauthorized use of land, damage to fencing, stress caused to livestock, and cleanup costs, all backed by documentation. It wasn't petty. It was precision. She didn't respond. Not at first. Instead, she doubled down. Posted on the HOA group board, which I don't belong to, mind you, claiming I intentionally disrupted a community celebration, that I neglected my animals and endangered guests. She had the nerve to add that rural residents should learn to adapt to suburban expectations. You ever get so mad you have to walk it off before your words catch fire? I didn't argue with her online. That's what she wanted, a spectacle. But I did share my version of events with a few neighbors who'd been asking what really happened. Miss Georgia told me folks were already buzzing. Turns out, cell phone footage of my sheep crashing the reception had gone semi-viral. A groomsman tried to post it as a joke. The joke, however, was on them. One clip, Buster the Ram charging full speed into the wedding cake, had over 400,000 views by Tuesday. Suddenly, Karen's carefully staged version of events started unraveling faster than a dollar store tablecloth. The bride's father reached out to me privately. Apologized. Said he had no idea they weren't allowed to be on my property and he'd assumed Karen had it handled. He even offered to pay for some of the cleanup. I accepted the apology, not the check. Karen? Oh, she stayed silent for a bit. Then came back swinging. Filed a formal complaint with the county about unsanitary livestock conditions near residential events. I showed up to the hearing with more paperwork than a tax office in April. The inspector took one look at my barn and said, "Sir, I've seen cleaner setups than most grocery store meat sections. Case closed." But here's where it gets sweet. Turns out Karen hadn't properly registered the wedding with the county. And when you host an event with over 75 people with alcohol and sound equipment, you need permits. She didn't have one. Not even close. So who got the fine? Not me. She did. Several of them. Noise ordinance violation. Illegal use of private land. Fire code issues. And my invoice? That's still pending in civil court. I'm not out for revenge. I'm out for principle. Because when folks like Karen get away with this stuff once, they do it again. And again. Until someone draws the line. That someone had to be me. And in the process, something changed in this town. Neighbors started checking in. A few who never said more than hello started waving, offering help. The local paper did a little piece on property disputes and community boundaries. No names. But the message was clear. People started remembering that just because someone's loud doesn't mean they're right. Just because someone shows up with polish and power doesn't mean they own the place. And just because you're quiet doesn't mean you're weak. As for me, I took a couple days and rebuilt the gate, cleaned up the garden, gave the sheep fresh hay and put new name tags on their collars. Buster got extra carrots for leading the most unexpected rebellion in local history. And I sat back on my porch watching the sun drop behind the hill, sipping iced tea like I just won a quiet kind of war. Because I did. She came in with a wedding. She left with a lesson.